certified life coaches with 45 years combined experience in human resources, Jen Trum and Katherine have both experienced the highest of highs and the lowest of lows, both personally and professionally. What they both know to be true is this: our mental, physical, and emotional health are the essential building blocks in order to thrive and shine in the field of HR. In a first of its kind podcast, we'll be getting real and we'll discuss and share what has contributed to both our success and struggles, with the goal of inspiring women around the globe to stand tall and take the necessary action to both thrive and shine in HR. Here are your hosts, Jen and Katherine.
Good morning and happy Monday, everybody. Hey, Katherine, how are you doing this morning?
I am so great. I was just looking at the banner as the music was playing, and I was like, holy cow, episode 16. This is completing 4 months of starting every single Monday with you, and I'm just so happy to be here with you and all of our listeners. What a fun thing to do.
Wow, that's the first time I thought about that too. 16 episodes, 4 months we've been doing this.
4 months.
Love amazing. It. Well, welcome to Thrive and Shine HR, everybody. We are kicking off our 16th episode, and today we are going to be talking about stress. We're going to be talking about stress. And so before we hop into stress, let's talk a little bit about our weekends, because as you all know, we record this on Monday mornings, our time. So Katherine, how was your weekend? What was your highlight for your weekend?
Oh, I think my weekend was amazing. I live in the middle of the Colorado Rockies, so we had snow all weekend, which may blow some of your minds. It's May 13th at the time of this recording. We were able to get out, my partner and I, Brett, I do have permission to talk about him. We were able to get out and do an amazing hike on Saturday, which was phenomenal. So that was a big highlight. We were able to go pretty high up in the high country, even given the snow. But I think the number one highlight, and I'll probably start tearing up, I got to talk to my mom yesterday, and I got to talk to her for a while, and we had some laughs, and I get to see her in a couple of weeks. My nephew's graduating from high school, so I'm going home to see a lot of my family, and it was just such a treat to get to speak to my mom on Mother's Day, when I know so many women out there don't have the ability to do that as we age or for other reasons. So I felt very lucky to be able to speak with her yesterday. Yeah. Aww. Mother's Day. Yeah. What about you, Jen?
Oh my
what was your highlight?
Oh, it was great. We, as many of you guys know out there, the United States over the weekend had like a bit of a light show with the northern lights. The aurora borealis, which is super, super unusual to get, but apparently there was some kind of geothermal storm that everybody was talking about. And so on Friday, I completely forgot all about it. Didn't know.
Totally.
On Saturday morning, I pull up Facebook and Instagram, and I'm like, oh, holy crap. So
yes.
I live in Southern Oregon. For those who don't know, we have Crater Lake, which is one of the huge landmarks in this area. There were pictures that people took of it. Like, if you haven't had a chance to see the aurora borealis over Crater Lake or some of the other landmarks, it's amazing. So then on Saturday, my husband and son, I had said, okay, for my Mother's Day present, y'all, I want to go out in the middle of dark and nowhere, and I want to be able to see this thing, because apparently it was supposed to be for the few nights for Friday and possibly Saturday night. We went out, we drove an hour, saw nothing. Unfortunately, the borealis did not make its presence known on Saturday evening. However, we had such a good time. It was just me and my son, 16. Getting him out of his room can be just a nightmare. So basically saying it was Mother's Day present, got him out of his room at 1:00 in the morning. We drove, we had just a really great time, just bombing. In terms of like what it was we wanted to do, it bombed like hell. But family time, going out in the middle of nowhere, we heard frogs and animals everywhere here in the middle of the night. So it was really nice. So yesterday, Mother's Day was like crash. I slept in. I took my time. I just didn't push myself too hard.
Yes.
Enjoyed the day like nobody's business. So it was a very unusual Mother's Day weekend, but one I think that's going to be for the books.
I love it. Absolutely for the books. I love
Yeah.
all of that.
Well, why don't we get in and start talking about stress? So, I first wanted to start off and thank all of our listeners in the community, all of our viewers. One of the things that Catherine and I like to do, we're inconsistent with it, but when we do it, I love to see how it blows up. So, in our Women of HR support group on Facebook, we have a poll that we typically try to do each week when it comes to the topic of the week. This week, I put out a question. It was like Wednesday, Thursday of last week.
Yeah.
Boy, did this one blow up. I think last time I checked, there was like 170 comments on it. It was a very simple question. It was just, how does stress come up for you? Or I can't even, do you remember exactly what the question was? It was something about in one
It was
word, talk about
yeah, in
stress.
one word or one sentence, what stresses you out the most, or something like that, something along
Yeah.
those lines. I definitely didn't nail it verbatim.
No, you didn't. I didn't either. It was one sentence. What stresses you out most in the HR world? So
Yes.
three of the ones that came up the most, I wanted to kind of read to everybody and just say, okay, here are the things that came up the most for our listeners and viewers. Number one was leadership only wants HR assistance when it benefits them, with 85 likes.
Yep.
Definitely a huge one that came up for so many of you is this frustration, this stress that builds up when leadership is only coming to us when it serves their needs, when it serves their wants and desires, versus when it's the right thing to do. Number two is managers and leaders who don't understand laws, right? The
Mhm.
frustration and the stress that comes up when our leaders don't know what the frick they're doing, and the stress that that brings up. And then
Yep.
the third one is we're business partners, not adult principal's office, right? The stress around the lack of care or concern for people out there when it comes to what it is we feel like we should be doing and what it is we feel like people are bringing to us. So these were the three things that came up through the poll, which I found so incredibly interesting. Catherine, what were your first thoughts when you heard those three sentences as the top ones that came up in the poll?
My first few thoughts were, I've totally been there. Yes, 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 up and down, totally been there. My second thought was, some of my current clients are struggling with these exact things. And then my third thought was, best news ever. Most of this is coming from stress, YOU. And we're going to talk about that today. What about you?
Nice.
What were your first thoughts?
You stress. My
Yes.
first thoughts were how interesting that all three of them, and really a vast majority on the list, were external. Right,
Bingo.
how interesting of that, and I think you
Bingo.
have a lot more to come on that as well, but that literally was my first thought. It's like, "Huh, how interesting," and I think that is something that the more and more, both of us we've kind of done the work that we've done. It is fascinating when we see, others who are complaining and frustrated, stressed, and then when you really start to kind of go under the surface, it's everything has to do with the uncontrollables outside of
Right.
ourselves. So that was definitely something that stood out to me pretty quickly.
Pretty quickly. Exactly. Exactly. And for me, I see this as the best news ever because
Same.
it's something that we can actually influence in terms of how we respond to those external factors. So
Yeah.
for me, yeah, it sounded as though the stress was really coming from how people were responding or approaching, as you said, to these external variables, to these external situations, to these external people. And I definitely, I think because of the work that I've done on, through self-coaching, through working with coaches, you're right. I mean, I think you and I both see this through a very different lens than we probably used to. And I think we're going to talk about that a lot today too.
I think so. Buckle your seatbelts,
Here we
everybody.
go.
All right, well, let's dig into our questions that I have worked up for us today. So the
Love it.
first one is, let's talk about history a little bit. Let's go in deep and
Ooh.
say, share a specific example or share an example where you felt overwhelmed by stress in your HR career, and how did you navigate through that at that time?
I have a really interesting example that for some reason keeps popping into my brain. As you can imagine, I have endless examples of things that stress me out. But the one that just keeps coming up for me this weekend, I keep reflecting back on a specific time where I was in back to back meetings. And I feel like this is really appropriate to share, considering this is what I hear from people all the time. I'm in back to back meetings, I'm getting pulled into things last minute, and I'm 99% sure it was open enrollment. So, quite literally, back to back meetings, trying to quote unquote stay on top of everything else. And I remember going to our local grocery store, our local market, which is about a 5-minute walk from where I used to work. And I remember walking past my partner, Brett's boss at the time. And Brett's boss was sitting on this bench, having lunch outside, enjoying the day, properly digesting his food, having a conversation with somebody else. And I remember being so pissed off because I ran past him, said, "Hey, so good to see you. Sorry, I can't talk." Ran in, got my lunch, ran back up to the office. I was probably gone for maybe 5 minutes. I was so stressed out because how dare I not bring my lunch that day? How dare I step outside to go get that lunch? Because I didn't have time for lunch, let alone stepping out for 10 minutes and going to get my lunch. I felt under the gun, so stressed about my day, so stressed about these back-to-back meetings. And as I sit in reflection of that, it was just so memorable because in some ways, if I'm being really honest, I still have embarrassment around it. I still feel as though, how did I not see the stress I was creating for myself? And what would it have been like if I had done the work I've done now over the past couple of years, 10 years ago? And hindsight's 2020, of course, but I just know that the way I show up now is not from a state of stress, YOU. I just show up with a lot more responsibility and a lot more awareness of if I'm creating my own shitstorm or not. So I don't know. That's the one that just keeps popping up for me. It just keeps surfacing in my mind. Jen, what about you? What's a specific example of stress for you that you'd like to share with our listeners?
I have about 5,000 examples of
Uh-huh.
self-imposed shitstorms. Right?
Self-imposed shitstorm. Sis.
Self-imposed shitstorms. You said something like that where while you were talking, I'm like, that's
I
it
wrote it down.
right there. The self and I can't even say it because it's almost like one of those tongue twisters. The self-imposed shitstorm, everybody. So I have so many examples I can think of, but I really actually want to go a little bit more current
Ooh.
than way past, and only because it's been so interesting to kind of see how different challenges can be. So for those who don't know, I don't think anybody actually on here other than you, Catherine, who know this, but I'm married. I've been married for 20 years this last October, and my
Amazing.
husband has been out of work now for 6 months. Talk about
Mm,
stress, right? For those
talk
of you
about
who have been
stress.
out of work for a long period of
Yeah.
time, it's a lot of stress. And I think, anyone who's ever gone through a period of time where, they're out of work and they're not feeling, super strong internally and that sort of thing, it just kind of, it can just flood us with, kind of irrational thinking, right? That sense of
Interesting.
desperation and overwhelm and all of that. And what's so interesting is I can see in my partner all of those things that I could feel in myself for many, 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 many years. And obviously, again, the 6 months out of work stress is different, but it's
Yeah.
still something that you can be able to observe and see how we also do the same sorts of behaviors, right? The isolation, the retreating within ourselves, the projecting, the deflecting. So a lot of things that happen when we're under stress, when we're under that fight, flight, or freeze,
Yeah.
and being able to kind of be reflective at this time in my life to see someone I care about who's really struggling and suffering, but also this self-imposed stuff that we do, right? This
Yeah.
self-imposed spinning and not kind of being able to kind of ground ourselves. And so this morning, I was telling you, Catherine, before we went live, I was listening to a meditation as I do each morning with Jay Shetty on Calm.
Yes.
And he was talking about this Japanese term called ma. And it's basically this idea of being able to give space in
Mm,
our lives, this healthy sense of space. And as I was listening to it this morning, I was just thinking that there would have been zero way 5, 10 years ago that I would have been able to kind of have the space giving capability that I think
yes.
I do now. And the reason I bring this up in this context is really because a lot of times it's not even so much our stress that's stressing us out. It's the stress of others that then we feel this weight of needing to have to carry and help and support. And this is like the HR way, right? It's like not only the stress that we own, it's everyone else's stress that we're now adding onto ourselves. And so, I think that this idea of being able to kind of reflect and be perceptive and recognize that stress in others has actually been a pretty cool, in a way. I mean, I use the word cool lightly, but a
Yeah.
really great way for me to actually look at someone else's stress and be able to learn myself in how I have really kind of failed or struggled to be able to
Interesting.
manage that and address it in the ways that I could have in the past. Because one example in particular was about, oh my gosh, it was just about 10 years ago when we had just moved to Oregon and my son was in a parade. They have a springtime parade here in the
Uh-huh.
valley, and he was doing karate at that time, and he was going to be in the parade, little karate boy, woo! And
So
all I
cute.
could think of was this work project that I was way behind on. It was way over my head, right? So
Yep.
here I was sitting the sidewalk watching these kids go by. And I literally all I could think about was, the stress and the work. And even by the time he finally passed by on the parade, I was clapping and I was excited, but my brain wasn't there.
Totally.
Right? My
Yes.
brain wasn't really there, and I can look
Yes.
back on that and see that so clearly, whereas, at the time, I was completely overwhelmed and completely out of the zone.
I I mean, as usual, my brain is going to similar situations in my life where
Yeah.
I have technically been with people after work, people that I love, and I have not been able to focus and be ever present because my mind is still working. I'm so
Mhm.
stressed out about something going on at work that I wasn't able to be ever present. And I bet what you just articulated is something that so many of our listeners can relate to without a
Yeah.
doubt.
Yeah,
Mm,
and I think that sometimes we're just so going through the motions, right? And this is one of the things that you and I have talked about a lot, right? It's
yeah,
like we're so going through the motions that we're not even really aware of the self-sabotage. We're not even really aware of the things that maybe we're doing that are actually keeping us from that space that we need, from that whatever it is that we most need to help
right,
release whatever it is that's built up. Why we do that, I don't know. There's lots of different reasons why, but I think the awareness and really why I brought that example up is it's not even so much me that's going through the stress right now. It's the ability of being able to reflect and view it from this other angle that actually is helping me with future stress right now here.
love it,
And I think that that is something that has been a really, an eye-opening experience to
right,
have this opportunity to see stress through another's eyes. So highly
right,
recommend if you haven't done that before.
love it.
All right, next question. So what are some common misconceptions about stress in the HR field? And now that you've encountered them, wait. Now that you've encountered them, how do you address them? So misconceptions in the field of HR
Oh,
around stress.
I'm gonna start with a really interesting one. I think there's a misconception, bear with me here. I may ruffle some feathers with this one. I think there's a common misconception that HR is a super stressful position. Hear me out on this one. I subscribe to that thought too. And I believe that thought to be true for the first 25 years of my career. And that thought became habitual. And going back to what you were just sharing, saying, I don't know where this sort of comes from. I think it comes from habit. I think it comes from habitual thinking that we just have been thinking for so long, we don't even realize it's an option. And it's a habitual thought that leads to habitual actions and habitual behaviors. And I'll never forget, I was on a walk and talk with a client in a nearby community. She works in HR. She was a client, and she said, I don't understand why most HR professionals stress out. HR just isn't stressful for me. I don't find it to be stressful. She said, am I doing it wrong? And at the time, I was like, I don't think you're doing anything wrong. So, what blows my mind is that there are absolutely HR practitioners out there who are thriving and shining, right? Truly. They're thriving and they're shining because they have either divorced themselves from a thought that HR is super stressful, or they've just never chosen that thought. And I know that may ruffle some further feathers, especially for people who are feeling super stressed out this morning. But I'm going big. And I'm just suggesting that if you feel super stressed out all the time, A, you are not alone. B, I was there for 25 years. And C, consider consider the idea that that thought may be influencing how you do show up in HR.
Mm,
I
yeah,
went right there, Jen.
I'm glad you did, Kathy, because I'm gonna follow right up. I'm gonna
Do
follow right up with
tell.
it.
I
Yeah,
cannot wait to hear what you have to say.
I think you're right on. I think, when we think about how we look at things, how we think about things, how we perceive things, it's it's humbling. It's humbling. And I think
Yeah.
that, as far as misconceptions go, I think there's a mass amount of it that is internal. And you and I talk so often about, self-awareness and taking that
Yes.
time to really understand what's going on. This one is a ringer. This one is really, truly a ringer, because when we really pay attention to the thoughts and the programming and the patterns that repeat within us around the things that we enjoy, the things that we don't enjoy, what brings us, all of that, right? We will start to notice much of what's kind of happening on the subconscious, which is really then a repetition of that. You start, making that story or that narrative around how
Right.
stressful, how difficult, and how hard it is. That's only going to perpetuate itself. I promise you that. And that is something I think people really struggle with really recognizing. We're so much in our groove around, the things that we do and the things that we know, that we're not really, I think, checking in on that very much.
Yeah.
And it's not that hard to do, but it can be a little uncomfortable. And I think
Mm.
that's why most of us don't do it. It's really, do I really believe that I hate HR? Is it really HR? Like trying to start to kind of tune into and question these beliefs and these feelings and this kind of sense of awareness that we might have around our jobs, around our careers, around our, whatever it is in our lives. And so, yeah, for me, the misconception really comes down to what can be changed? What do we have control over? Our thoughts, right? Our beliefs, our
Mhm.
awareness. And
Mhm.
how do we start to like become more intentional? Where does
Right.
that begin?
Right.
And like that's something that I think that just really begins with kind of that shift.
Right.
And and that courage to stop taking excuses. The courage to stop taking and making excuses, right?
Ooh. What do you mean by taking excuses?
Knowing that it's there and walking right into it, although you know deep down that there's a better way, right? We all do
Choice.
it. We all do
Choice.
it, right? It's choices, right?
Whoa.
It's our consent that we're giving every day to make the choices that we're not quite ready to shift for whatever reason. Yet we know, we actively know. This is like I may need to do some apologizing to our listeners and viewers later, because this is like really kind of going in terms of like, tough love. It's like, we are very aware. I think we're way more aware than we give ourselves and others credit for around those behaviors that we're currently doing that we're not really happy with, yet we're not ready to change quite yet. And it's like, that's it right there, right? When we know the things that maybe we should be doing, that we could be doing, but yet deep down, we're not going to tell anybody else this, but deep down, we're not doing it. And so when it comes to like all of these things that build up within our lives, the sooner we start taking that ownership, I think everything can start shifting. I really do. And that's a misconception that goes way deeper than I think we thought we were going to go. But I feel like it's so important, because that is the level of ownership we all have access to, and yet we're not taking. And yet that is the question that we need to like spend time with. But how many of us
Mhm.
do, right? That's a level of deepness. I don't know. Do I want to
No,
go there?
you know what you're making me think about? Well, I want to back up a little bit, because when you say, I think we may owe our listeners, an apology or something like that, because this is a little bit of tough love. I think we would be doing our listeners a disservice by not going right to the root. I
Mhm.
am not a fan of placating. I'm not a fan of politicking. And I feel as though if we don't talk about the real thing, I think we're contributing to the sis. I wrote this down, the self imposed shitstorm. I don't want any of our listeners to be misled, because if we approach this topic very softly, we are almost encouraging or enabling our listeners to continue continue with their SIS, their self-imposed shitstorm. So I think I think it's just so important to get to the root. And I'm flashing back to an HR Empower Hour I led a couple of weeks ago called Love or Leave HR. And there was a woman who had never been to HR Empower Hour before. She came for the first time ever. And I walked everybody through this exercise. And the very first part was breaking down your HR duties and figuring out which HR duties you love and which ones you want to leave. And then we talked about approach. We went through this whole exercise. And by the end of an hour, by the end of the hour, she was like, oh my God, I love HR. I need to leave my approach to HR. So within an hour, she got exactly what we're talking about today. And she had this massive aha moment, and she's gone on to adjust how she's approaching HR. We took her from totally disempowered thinking she thought she wanted to leave our profession to realizing she loves HR, and it all comes down to her approach. So I just believe, Jen, so much in this podcast that we're doing and this topic in particular today. It's everything.
That is such an amazing story. I love that. You and I have talked about that before, where we've both had experiences like that, where people who were so freaking burned out on HR just as a whole, right? I am done with HR. And really it was
Yes.
perspective. And
Yes.
being able to shift that perspective, it's like finding like a whole new world of possibility, right?
Yes.
Everything that I think she loved about HR became like highlighted, and you can really be able to like see it for what it truly can be when you can wash away all this crap that she was holding on to about why she thought it was
Yes.
right.
Oh, what a
Wonderful.
I mean, what a beautiful visual. Just that washing away and that
Yeah.
cleansing
Yeah.
and that shedding of habits that we don't even see as habits. It's just wild. It's wild.
Yeah. It for sure is wild. So, next question, let's jump
Yeah.
into this. How do you differentiate, or how do you help your clients differentiate between different types of stress, right? So, there's
Mm.
all kinds of different types of stress. How do you help others differentiate that, especially in the context of HR?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I a couple of years ago, and Jen, I shared this as we were prepping for this podcast. A couple of years ago, I did lead a workshop called Stress versus Burnout, kind of like a which are you suffering from and why. And there are three different types of stress. There's acute stress, there's episodic acute stress, and then there's chronic stress. And the other one that I talk about is eustress, YOU. So it's this SIS, right? The self-imposed shitstorm. And so for me, I talk a lot like acute stress. An example of acute stress, and not to be Debbie Downer, but this is a part of HR. Being the point of contact if you do have an employee who passes away. There's a lot that's involved in benefits. There's a lot that's, at least in my experience, working directly with family members, helping them understand if they are the appointed beneficiary, death certificates that are required, all of those types of things. So for me, that's an example of acute stress. When an employee passes away, oh my God, what do I do? Episodic acute stress, a lighter version could be open enrollment. Something that comes up year over year over year that does infuse this very temporary but acute, right? It just comes up over and over and over again, but it's acute. And then chronic is obviously when it just happens constantly. And the example I can think of that I thought about on my walk this morning was a client that I had who HR director and the ownership of the organization was continuously letting her know that the organization was in financial duress and they may have to be letting people go. So it was just this constant communication of our numbers aren't there, our numbers aren't there. You're going to have to think about layoffs. You're going to have to think about RIFs. And it was just this chronic stress that she needed to deal with in HR. And then, of course, you and I have talked quite a bit about what I call eustress, YOU, so the self-imposed shitstorm. So for me, those are sort of the 4 main buckets of stress that I really help my clients understand. And then obviously, maybe not obviously, we dive into Paul Stoltz's work on adversity and how is your AQ, your adversity quotient, and do you tend to shy away from adverse or stressful situations? Or are you on the other opposite end of the spectrum where you harness it? You actually love, and maybe love's too strong of a word, but you welcome stress. You're the type of person who's like, you know what? And this is going to sound really weird. It's going to sound really weird. I don't welcome death at all, period. I'm terrified of dying. Yet, when I had one employee die for 5 years in a row, I had 5 employees die within a 5-year period. It was acute. It was really stressful. It was awful. But I knew my role was to show up in a certain way, to be there for those family members, to be there for the employees, to be there for the organization who was grieving collectively, but also individually and everything in between. And obviously over here with the family members too. And I just believe that it comes down to the energy we want to put forth into the world. Now, I'm not saying if you're in fight or flight and you're unable to deal to suddenly just try and fake it. I'm not saying that at all. But I do think that in HR, we tend to think that it's a hard profession. And what I like to think is that we can do hard things. We are strong, we are competent, we are resilient. And it's by developing those types of skills that we can respond to real deal stress. Jen, like what you're going through with your husband. Being out of work is not easy. And how we show up, how we respond. And just understanding the differences between the different types of stress so that you can gain some sort of an awareness and an observance to be graceful with yourself as well. Boy, did I just go all over the place. When you think about, Jen, differentiating between stress, what comes up for you?
One of the things that you brought up a little bit ago, I want to go back a little bit because you brought up
Let's
what is it, an adversity quotient? The
Yeah,
Paul,
AQ. Paul
tell me,
Stoltz.
Paul
So
Stoltz. I gotta look into
yeah,
that.
Paul
That's
Stoltz
so
is
fascinating.
the premier researcher on adversity and how humans respond to adverse situations. He's written several books, and I cannot think of the one. The Adversity Advantage was a book that I really enjoyed reading by him. He speaks about adversity through the eyes of, and I may get his last name wrong, Eric Weinemeyer. He went blind. He was not born blind, but he is a world-renowned mountain climber. And so Paul and Eric co-wrote this book called The Adversity Quotient, and it sort of talks about the difference between people who are climbers, meaning people who harness adverse situations, and then there's campers, people who kind of do the bare minimum. I mean, think about this in terms of HR. And then there's quitters. There's people who just quit. And there are people like they all of a sudden stress comes up and they just quit and they cower or they resist. And I also find that there are people who quit ahead of time, which means that something happens and before they even try to address it, before they even try to rise to the occasion, they choose a narrative in their mind that kind of like what you were talking about with excuses. They just don't even try. They quit ahead of time. An example of this would be if there's a promotion, maybe a VP of HR becomes available in your organization or another organization, and you decide because you don't have a master's degree or you don't have 100% of the preferred qualifications, you don't apply. That's quitting ahead of time.
It was so interesting. You had mentioned a story about, someone who, was chronically struggling to figure out what was going to happen within the organization, right? Or is it
Yes.
going to be this? Is
Yes.
it gonna be
I can
that?
see her right now in my brain. Yeah.
Yeah, and I actually have one that's super, super similar to that, where I was working with someone and they were in the process of some huge organizational transitions. And
Oh,
so
yeah.
he was the lead HR for one plant, for one location, right? And then the
Uh-huh.
head location. And this went on for like months and months and
Mm-hmm.
months, right? Didn't know so many different things, didn't know whether or not they were going to do layoffs, didn't know when, all of that. And yet, here this individual was, and we were kind of working together at that time. And in the course of the several months, they were in this like unknown period, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
talk about stress is like when
Mm-hmm.
you're kind of in this unknown. And yet through the course of this individual, she was able to like really start to kind of shift that over time by starting to become aware of what it was that she was thinking about, like what was coming up for her every
Right.
time she would think about the unknown, right? And for
Yeah.
her, every time she was like, oh, and the huge list of all these things, right? And it was happening behind the scenes. And this is something we talked about a little bit earlier, is like when you're in a situation, whether it's acute, which Catherine, I didn't know that was 5 and 5 years.
Mm.
I am so sorry to hear that. I mean,
Mm.
I can't even imagine. Like, I can't imagine. And like
Yeah.
that type of stress, a whole different ballgame. But at the same time, like this individual that I worked with who was going through all of these, organizational changes, and, she was thinking, do I leave? Do I stay? Do I this? And, at the end of the day, she rose. She
Hell yeah.
rose and she had that choice. We had a few different sessions where she was doing exactly what you were talking about. She's like, you know what? I think I'm just going to leave. I'm on Indeed. I'm going to, she
Yep.
wanted to bail. She wanted to hide. She wanted to give up, all of those things. And the more that she kind of held with it and allowed herself to kind of go through the discomfort of like not knowing, but hold with it, she came out of it with more confidence,
Ah,
with more groundedness, with more awareness with herself, and feeling like, you know what? Like, I didn't think that this was something I was really capable of, to go through that much chaos with that much uncertainty. But here I am. And a lot of it had to do with her willingness to kind of sit with it,
yep.
to sit with that discomfort, that unknowing, and be okay with it and just keep taking a step forward. And
Yep.
by doing that, she could prove to herself. And here's the biggest, I think, for listeners and viewers out there, is we want proof, right? We want that proof. We need it. We got to have it. And so many times we have this lack of willingness to really show up, to really step up and engage, because we
Yeah.
don't have the proof. So instead, we'll kind of believe this lie, or we'll believe this story within ourselves that we just can't. I'm just not good enough. I wouldn't be able to anyway, right? So we kind of start building this narrative around why it's not going to work and why it won't happen. And this is only what just then perpetuates the cycle, right? It's about what you talked about and what others do, where we say, okay, I'm in it and I'm going to take this next step. And it's really freaking hard, but that's where the glory comes from, is that willingness
Mm.
to kind of go outside that perpetual pattern that we've been used to in some way, and get outside of it and kind of go a little rogue.
Yeah.
So I love it. I thought it was so cool how closely intertwined our stories were,
Yeah. No
because
kidding.
that is so common, I think, for
Yes.
for you and I, and for so many others out there that we're in these situations, acute, chronic, you, whatever, right?
Yeah.
We're in these situations. It doesn't matter. It
It
has to
doesn't
be
matter.
about breaking the cycle, becoming aware, and then being conscious and intentional around where you really actually want to go instead. And that, I think, is really where kind of the key has kind of shifted for me. All
That's
right.
amazing. That's amazing. I love that you're, it's just like, great. There are these definitions out there, but does it really matter? Because how we show up. I mean, that is truly key. And having that awareness of how we're currently showing up. And do we want to continue with that or not? I love that, Jen.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
There's
Brilliant.
such a good TED talk that, what's the name?
Yes.
I wrote it down somewhere. It's, oh, how to stay calm when you know you'll be stressed. The guy's name is
Ooh.
Daniel Levitin, and it's a
Uh-huh.
TED talk from several years ago, but it's so good. It's 20 minutes, very much worth your time, because HR, not HR, it doesn't matter. We know when we're going to be going into an environment where there's a potential for stress. It's going to be an interview, it's a performance review, it's a write up, it's a termination. Pick your pleasure, right?
Right.
When we know that that's going to be a part of the reality of the role. So being more intentional and proactive about preparing ourselves for inevitable stress, I think, is a superpower. I think it truly is. And I think
Yeah.
that if there's anything that anyone can get out of this conversation today, it's finding ways to be intentional around human behaviors that are inevitable. And stress is an inevitable human behavior that we are all going to have to face. And
Yep.
so, how do we become more intentional around that strategic, that strategery,
Yes.
the strategic actions that we know that we will take when it does arise? And
Right.
very few of us have that. We don't have that, like, you know, briefcase. I don't even know the way to describe it, but we don't really have that, like, armor that we can really pick to. And that may not even be the right word, but what we can pick to when the chronic, when the acute, when the stress, when those stresses do arise, what are you going to do? Right? What are you going to do? And that's where I think we, have, that gift that I think that we've given with so many clients is giving that empowered way to be able to address the stress that is inevitable. Any thoughts on
Agree.
that before we jump to the next question?
No, I love that. I think that really flows into the next question quite beautifully, actually.
It
Not
does.
surprisingly, Jen. You've lined this
Well,
up so perfectly.
when we think about stress and we think about the root causes of stress,
Mm.
what have you noticed as a coach, as a HR? What have you noticed in terms of patterns, trends? What does it come down for you in terms of root cause? Where does it come to?
One place, universal, for every person I've ever worked with since 1997,
Wait
which is
for it.
wild. Wait for it. 2 words: self-doubt. The root
Boom.
cause. Yeah, self-doubt. And here's how self-doubt will show up in a stressful situation. I can't. I don't know. I don't want to. I'm scared. And the irony, the antidote is our title's human resources, right? For me, it's trusting in ourselves that we can be resourceful. It can be a simple shift of, I don't know, but I know I can figure it out.
Yeah.
When that stress comes in, I know I can remain calm. I know, okay, tech just blew up and I'm about to do a 2-hour presentation for Central California SHRM. I'll figure it out. I'll figure it out. So it truly comes down to quite honestly, habitual thought patterns that we're choosing, which sounds so scientific and nerdy, but it's really not. It's just trusting in ourselves that we do know. We do know how to respond to the stress. We do know how to show up. We do know how to rely on others. We do know how to ask for help. And that may sound really simple, but if you're being honest with yourself, and if you're listening to this specific episode, it's probably because you find yourself stressed out so often. So my just little tidbit, little tip is just recognize when stress comes up and just pause and take a look at the thoughts that you feel like are just happening that you have no control over. But the beautiful thing is that you do have control over your thoughts in response to any situation in this lifetime. Wild. Again, I don't
Not,
know why wild keeps coming out of my mouth today, but it's wild. It's
it is,
wild. What do you see,
it,
Jen?
oh, yeah, I was like, as you were talking, I had little tears kind of welling up because for me, it's so the same. It's a deep, deep fear of
Yeah.
not being good enough.
Yes.
You know, it's
Yes.
a deep, deep, deep
Yes.
fear
Deep.
of not being enough. And
Right.
everything kind of comes from that. And the stress is really around trying to make everything happen. Right?
Mm,
You're trying to do it all and be it all. And it's really about like that fear of, well, what if I let this drop? And what if I da 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 da? And you can kind of go down so many lists. And we really truly do that, to ourselves around, kind of creating this unnecessary drama.
mhm.
And, you know, I could go on and on, but it's such a simple answer for me. It's like a paralyzing fear of not being good enough.
Yes.
And then from that paralyzing fear of not feeling good enough, that sense of I need to make, everyone happy, right? The people pleasing. I
Oh
need to
gosh,
make sure
yes.
I get everything done. And yet, you know, more and more and more and more and more in my life, I'm realizing that by putting up more boundaries, putting up more clear kind of walls around my space, my
Yeah.
energy, my intention, right? The other thing I think that we do is we say yes too much. We're
Mm,
not saying no enough. We're not putting up appropriate boundaries that really feel good within
yes.
our heart, right? We're doing it for maybe other people or for other
Mhm.
reasons. And yeah, I could go down such a rabbit hole, but from a place of like just open-hearted, um, what does it really come down to? It's the little girl, right? It's the little
Mm,
girl of wanting to feel like I can do it all and be it all and be accepted and
yes.
be valued and appreciated. And so like when we talk about like self-awareness and we talk about like all of these things that we can do for ourselves, the first and foremost thing for us is always going to be how can we better soothe ourselves,
Yeah.
right? How can
Yeah.
we be better about soothing ourselves and everything else be damned? First and foremost, that oxygen mask has got to go
Mm,
on our mouth.
yeah.
And so we can talk so many different terms and strategies, and there's so many different things that we can put out there and offer to our listeners and viewers, but it's the oxygen mask first and foremost.
Right.
And then it has to be about the why. Like, what is it that's really creating this angst and this worry and this anxiety, right? And really tuning into that and working with a coach, working with a counselor, working with someone who can help us tap into that because that is where it gets deep. And that is where kind of these perpetual things keep rising.
Right.
But without it, without that awareness, we'll kind of keep, we just kind of keep going around and around in this like unwittingly in
Yes.
this storm, right?
Yes.
And so it has to be an intentional shift.
I totally agree. I totally agree. Awareness and then an intentional shift through practice.
Yeah.
Truly.
All right. Well, we are running long this episode, and I don't care. We're gonna get through it. We got two
We're
more
going to
questions.
roll.
All right. How do you create a supportive environment within HR? So within your HR environment that really helps to openly manage stress in a collective way.
Ooh, I think that depends on what your HR environment is. For our listeners who have HR teams who are, quite literally on a team, I recommend to start having real conversations, starting with your own vulnerability and opening up about your experience with stress. What is quote unquote stressing you out, and start having conversations. I do recommend, though, that if you are on a team where, and this is just very, very common specifically for women, that if you're on a team and you're opening up about stress, but you have a tendency to commiserate, you have a tendency to blame and shame. And here's what that sounds like. God, our CEO is such a narcissist and he's making our lives hell, right? So be very, very conscientious. Going back to what, Jen, you were saying in the very beginning, are you shaming and blaming others and making excuses for the stress that you're allowing into your life? Meaning, okay, our boss is such a narcissist, or something. I mean, it's just an example. And does your team say, oh yeah, like that's the reason why we're so stressed out? That isn't the reason why you're stressed out. It's not. It's how you're showing up, the thoughts you're choosing. And I really mean this. And if you are sitting here having some resistance or getting prickles all over your body saying, this is so not true, this is so not true, that resistance will persist, and just sit with it. You're having that resistance for a reason, and imagine what's on the other side of that resistance, right? So just backing up a little bit. I think if you have a team and you have the ability to be vulnerable, and some things have really landed for you a little bit differently today. It's about improving our skills of resiliency and accountability and tenacity and all confidence, self-worth, all of those skills. The antidote is really developing those skills. So if you have a team where you can be honest, but then really support one another in developing those skills, great. If you don't, maybe you're an HR team of one. I highly recommend joining any Facebook community that Jen or I have, and really just start paying attention a little bit differently. Noticing when you are participating in a Facebook community that perhaps is going down the rabbit hole in a certain way, and just noticing, not judging others, but getting curious about it, getting really curious about our self-doubt, getting really curious about our stress. And of course, HR Empower Hour, every single Tuesday, we are combating stress. We are developing all of the skills that I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago. And I invite every single listener to come check out HR Empower Hour. It's the course that I developed for this exact reason. After witnessing, whether you're in HR or not, the compounding effects of unmitigated stress. And I just want to do my part for the rest of my professional career to help people get out of their habitual patterns of responding to stress in a non-healthy way. So that's really the premise of HR Empower Hour. What about you, Jen? How do you recommend creating environments?
Amazing. Well, it's so interesting because I wrote the question, and then after writing the question and you kind of responding to it, I'm like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense. So I wrote the question because I am on an HR department of 3. And
Yeah.
so in terms of being able to kind of have that collective environment, I agree with you completely. If you have the collective environment, start talking about it and not ruminating.
There you go.
Be
There,
very
you said it very succinctly.
be
Yes.
very clear about how we are talking about our stress. And I think that when we can do so and become more intentional about talking about it in ways that are going to be proactive, that are going to be, you know, lifting in a positive way towards, something that we were moving towards versus the commiserating and the ruminating that I think I was a part of for a long, long
Oh,
time.
yeah.
And, as I'm like thinking about that question, I think it makes it makes everything of a difference.
Yes.
It makes everything of a difference in terms of the people that we choose to surround ourselves around and the
Yes.
people that we choose to kind of talk about the things that are burdening us, because
Yes.
it is in how we're talking about it. Like the way that you explained it was like, boom, it was such a mic drop because it is not even so much in who we're talking about, it's in how we're communicating. So your HR Empower Hour, to be able to have a community of other people who are accountable, who are taking ownership, but yet also are like trying to breathe in something that is more, right? Something that is better than like this ick that we feel. I mean, who feels good after a ruminating bitch session? Like, who out there feels good after that? But I can tell you what, people are feeling good coming out of HR Empower Hour every single week. So that is the key. You got to find those communities and those collective
Agreed.
groups where you can
Agreed.
feel comfortable to be able to share your truth, but also not get caught in the muck.
Right.
Because there are many, many, many people out there who are very excited and willing to hear your concerns, frustrations, but they're it's not going to be the positive and uplifting. Let's see how we can help you grow from this
Yes.
experience. And
Yes.
rather, it's going to be, well, let's start bitching about that narcissist asshole,
Totally.
right?
100%.
And that's what we have to start tuning ourselves into, are those individuals who are encouraging us to bring the best out of ourselves or bring the best out of others versus others who are encouraging the opposite.
It's
And that
this.
awareness around that is like so, so critically important.
Yes. I mean, it's you're absolutely right. And there's the human brain is hardwired for judgment. So it's not surprising that people bond over commiseration. However, we do have a
Mhm.
prefrontal cortex. And when you surround yourself with people who have learned how to use their prefrontal cortex in a very empowered way, your life will never be the same. It just won't. It just won't.
Well, that's a great way to end, or actually to give the last question and then we'll end because we've already gone a little over, but that's okay.
Yeah.
I don't care. Last
I don't
question.
care.
In your experience, what role does self-awareness play in effectively managing stress? Stress. My God, where's my mouth today? In effectively managing stress, and how can HR professionals cultivate this quality?
I think self awareness is everything. And humility is everything. Realizing that there's always room for more self awareness, a deeper sense of self awareness. I oftentimes hear HR professionals thinking, I need, when you think about the trainings you need to go to, people think about, I need to go to a training on state of federal law. I need to go to a training on ADA, compliance, FMLA, some of what we consider to be like hard skills of HR. But here's what I recommend everyone, all of our listeners, think about. If you go to a training on, let's say, ADA, compliance, but you haven't developed your essential skill of self-worth or confidence, it doesn't matter how many trainings you go to. for those hard skills of HR, to learn how to do EEOC reporting. If you lack the skill of confidence, if you lack the skill of self-worth, they are skills. If you don't do the work to enhance those skills, to increase those skills, you will forever be drowning in HR. And I think it's the one thing we just skip over as HR practitioners. We go right to the KSAs, we look at our job descriptions, and we are constantly so focused on the hard skills that we have completely forgotten about the soft skills. And if we don't elevate, and I hate to say soft skills, but that's what it's known as, right? The skills of confidence, the skills of resiliency, the skills of tenacity, all of those types of skills. And I think when we get really honest with ourselves through self-awareness, through taking the time to sit back and say, hold up, how am I showing up and what skills do I actually need to work on? That's the game changer. So in my opinion, self-awareness is everything. It's everything. Jen, what do you think?
I love that, love that, love that. So I wrote a couple things down. I said, what we need to do is we have to get under the hood of our stress. So getting under the hood of our stress means, number one, we need to be honest and we have to recognize where we're knowingly adding on stress and load in our lives.
Boom.
I know. I know.
Boom.
But that's what getting under the hood means, right? Whether or not it's pretty or not pretty, you got to open it up and you got to really be honest with yourself. Where am I knowingly adding on stress and load in my life? And is this because I don't believe that I'm worthy to be able to stand up and speak up for myself? I know I'm going there. And then here's the biggest one. And I would write this down for anyone who really struggles with this. What do I still need to learn about myself that's keeping me from learning this lesson and finding myself continually adding stress onto my life? This is it, y'all. This is it, because there
Mic
is
drop.
something, I know there's something about ourselves that we haven't yet fully really learned or embraced about ourselves that's causing us to, whether it's knowingly or unwittingly, take on the stress, right? And it's not until we can actually, one, be aware of it. That self-awareness, you're right, is everything. And then two, it's being honest and truly honest with yourself about what needs to change. And then three, taking that first step.
Yes.
Taking
Yes.
that first step. But yeah, getting under the hood, seeing at the sis, right? That self-imposed shitstorm. What is that? What does that look like? And how brutally honest can I be with myself? Because it's only going to be within myself that this is ever going to change. There it is.
All I'm thinking about is, do we need to like create a new group or a new podcast called the cis antidote, the self-imposed shitstorm antidote? Like that's all that keeps. I wrote this acronym down and I'm just going to roll with it today.
I love it. I think we need to
This.
roll with, I think we need to roll with it as we move forward throughout our lives forever.
100%.
It's all
100%.
about, where are you creating a sis, Kathy?
Seriously. Seriously. Yeah.
All right, everyone, we have gone way over. I so appreciate you sticking in with us and hanging out with us. And
Amazing.
yeah, stress is a big one. We knew it was going to be a long one today, right, Catherine?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
We knew it was going to be a long one. So we want to thank you all in understanding that HR Empower Hour is tomorrow. So know that you've got resources, you've got support out there. It's a biggie. It's a biggie to start really tackling in a true and honest way with ourselves. So don't let this moment pass you by without really starting to kind of think about what you can start doing today around your stress. So everyone, thank you again for joining us. And don't forget, every single day is a great opportunity to thrive and shine in HR. Have a great day, everyone.
See you next week.